anything, I want to acknowledge my beautiful smoking hot trophy wife here. 26 years. She is the backbone of everything that goes on, and she built the websites, and she's supported me these last 26 years. She just went like this with her hand, put it up to your mouth. So she's got me going here. All right. So what you're looking at here is a guy who's, we just came off of Palm Springs. We were in Palm Springs last Sunday, and at my 65th class reunion. That makes me 83 this October. So, you know, that is an amazing thing in itself. For me to be standing up here after all we've been through, wow, we'll get to that. And then we went to Montana, and we're here, and so we've been living out of a suitcase for a week, and we'll get home tomorrow. But I am absolutely thrilled to be here to speak with all of you. You know, my journey, you're looking at somebody who's going to be expressing about this whole thing they call transgenderism, which is a fake word, by the way, from a viewpoint of 78 years of experience. 78 years of experience. So I didn't come by this by reading books. I came by it because my grandmother started cross-dressing me when I was 4 years old. And just so we get this clear, cross-dressing children for any reason is child abuse. It's psychological child abuse, it's emotional child abuse, and it does damage to them for the rest of their life. It's for the medical community, it's institutionalized child abuse. Nobody is getting gender-affirming care. If we were doing gender-affirming care, we would not give anybody hormones or surgery. It's the opposite. You got to flip everything upside down. So as a result of being cross-dressed at the age of 4, my grandma made me a purple chiffon dress, told me how cute I was, and I have no idea why she did this. You know, I guess I showed some interest in wearing women's clothing, but she made me the purple dress, and whenever I was over at her house and she was the babysitter, she would put me in the dress and I was wearing the dress. That's indoctrination. It's destructive. And if it was benign and insignificant, I wouldn't be here today talking to you about what happened when I'm 83 years old. Right? Nobody in world history has ever changed their gender. It's never happened. All the terminology is just wrong. There are no transgenders. It's a word that they use to make all of you think that they changed genders. They use the other word transitioning to make you think that they transitioned. The fact of the matter is, hormones and surgery only feminizes men and masculinizes women. You can change your persona, but you cannot change your gender. You know what we've done, I'm sorry to say, is we've sort of bought into their language. Every time we use the word transgender, we're actually supporting the idea that it happens. When we talk about transitioning, we're supporting something that doesn't happen. I'm trying to claw all that language back. Even in our churches, we all know here, this is about Jesus, right? The power and grace of Jesus Christ. We know in the womb, we are conceived by sperm and egg. 9 months before we're ever born. But then they use a terminology, what sex or gender were you assigned at birth? Another fake terminology. That's not, you know why they said that? So that they can unwind it after birth. If you think that your gender is assigned at birth, they think that they can change it afterward. You know, especially in our churches, which have, I believe, sadly, we're not doing enough to talk about this in our churches. And more churches are starting to get into it. And I've been able to speak about it. We need to talk about God's design of man and woman. There is only men and women. The idea that people can self-assign non-binary. Just by, think about this for a minute. If I claim that I'm non-binary, you're actually saying you're binary. You get it? Right? I mean, this is how absolutely insane this whole thing is, and yet we go around claiming these things happen. So I'm hoping today that we can begin to think about not using their terms. We need to use the terms man and woman. Do we need to help the people who are struggling? Yeah. But let me tell you something. Many of the kids that are identifying as transgender in their teens are really not struggling. They're doing it because it's a social contagion. That's all. They're doing it because their friends are doing it. Now, from what happened to me, I can tell you, and it was mentioned here earlier about early childhood issues. You see, my mom, when I was born, did not want me. She already had my brother. And she was not 20 years old. She was not equipped for having a second child. It was during the war in 1940 when I was born. And she began to physically abuse me when I was 2. My grandmother's cross-dressing me when I'm 4. When my dad found out about the purple dress, he began to physically discipline me when I was 5 or 6 years old. And then his adopted brother, Uncle Fred, when I was 7 or 8 years old, because I had been wearing the purple dress that Grandma made for me, he decided that I was fair game to sexually molest. So here's a little kid in Los Angeles, California, in the 1940s, who has a mother that did not want him, a grandma who's cross-dressing him, a dad who's disciplining with a hardwood floor plank and leaving welts on him, and an uncle who's sexually abusing him. Now, I don't know about you guys, but that's not a real good way to start. But the finish is good. So, how did all this sort of work out? Well, kind of fast forward to where we are today, married 26 years. We started 15 years ago a website, sexchangeregret.com, because after I identified as Laura Jensen for 8 years, and I started studying psychology at UC Santa Cruz and started working in places where I was doing counseling, I found out that everybody, I'll use that word, which is strong, everybody that I have worked with, I haven't worked with everyone there is, but everybody that I have worked with suffered from some adverse childhood experience that caused them to not like who they were. This is not gender dysphoria. It's trauma. It's abuse. It's neglect. We are harming an entire generation of children with this absolute insanity of, quote, gender transitioning. It really sickens me. And I am glad that there's places like in Kentucky and other places where they're clawing that back and saying, no, you can't have our children. You can't medically castrate them. Do you realize that these children And then they tell me in their emails, and when I talk to them after they've gone through these procedures, they'll say, I wanted to be a dad, but now I can't. I wanted to be a mom, but now I can't. Have we really processed the amount of issues that this is implicated on? We have children that will never be fathers. Girls who will never be mothers bear children. That's a consequence of this insanity. It's amazing, isn't it? The fact of the matter is, there is absolutely no one, not a single person, that needs to have their genitals cut off, their breasts cut off, or jammed full of hormones and given a new name. They do need some good psychotherapy. And that's what happened with me. I went through a lot. And I was fortunate in many ways that as I grew up and having gone through the childhood I did, I always wanted to be successful. I always wanted to overcome everything. But when I saw Christine Jorgensen on the headlines back in the 50s, I thought, that must be who I am. And kids get things planted in their head. Our brains are not developed until we're 25 and we're changing their gender at 7, 8, 10, 12, 15. Come on. And I'm one of those. I saw Christine Jorgensen and had the dress, had the abuse, had all the adverse childhood experiences in my life, no place to turn, and I said, that's probably who I am. And so eventually, I got to say this because this is one thing that people don't understand. We have literally, through our website, sexchangeregret.com, worked with thousands of people over the last 15 years. And we've worked around the world. Over 90% of the people, including myself, who've gone through these procedures, males, who've gone through these procedures are heterosexual men with no same-sex attraction. They're not homosexual. It's not an issue of sexuality for a great number of these people. Is that shocking? It's an issue of trauma, abuse, neglect, undeveloped childhood, undeveloped relationship with the father, the modeling of a father. I did not want to be who I was. And by the way, many of the people that I've worked with, boys that I've worked with, will say they wanted to cut their genitals off, not because they wanted to be women, but because they never wanted to be sexually abused. And that was their defense mechanism. If my genitals are gone, then nobody will touch me there again. Pretty amazing. When we sit down, like I have, and sat down, I have probably talked and read emails and been around the world and talked to more people who've engaged in this practice than maybe anyone. I'm guessing that. But I've been doing it a long time. The first person I ever met was over 25 years ago. I detransitioned almost 34 years ago. And what I've found is if we sit down, and I always ask him this one question. I don't talk about gender dysphoria. I don't talk about transgenderism or transitioning. I say, what caused you to not like who you are? Why do you think that doing hormones and surgery is going to make you better? Explain it to me. I challenge them to explain to me how that's going to make them better. And they stop, and they begin to reflect. And then we begin to have a conversation about, like one gentleman I just talked to recently, I said, how did you get to this point where you had surgery and you're identifying as transgender and have the surgery and all that? He's in his 70s. And he didn't quite understand it. But when I asked him about his childhood, I said, when did this onset of this idea that you needed to become a woman take place? He said, when I was 13. And I said, tell me what was going on in your life at 13 years old, in your house, in your environment. What was that like? He says, my mom was a raging alcoholic, would get a butcher knife about 3 times a week and try to murder my dad. Now, because you're looking at a very brilliant person here, I was able to figure out that that was trauma. I mean, I went to school a long time, figured that one out, right? And so he had been going to a gender therapist, which, by the way, under no circumstances, at any time, for any reason, should you ever go to a gender therapist. Period. Avoid them with a passion, run the other way. They will harm you. So I told him he was going to his, transgender therapist, and I told him, I said, when you go back to your therapist tomorrow or the next day, whenever it is, don't dress up in your little feminine outfit. Take off the red pumps, take off the dress, go in there and say that Walt Heyer told me I need a trauma therapist. And he did that to his gender therapist. And this is how the insanity just drives me mad. She told him, I'm not only a gender therapist, I'm also a trauma therapist. Now, she had been taking the $225 a week for who knows how long, right? Never asking about his childhood. So she decided to test him on the ACEs scale, and he tested 7 out of 10. Very high. She said, well, instead of the usual, I'm using my words, instead of the usual 1-hour session where I rip you off for $225, we'll actually do EMDR therapy. And so they had a 2-hour session. He's writing me back the next day, EMDR therapy, and he says in his email, Walt, it was the worst, most painful hour that I ever spent in therapy. But I'm free. But I'm free. From 13 to 73, I had 3 emails with him. Got him to go to a gender therapist, or trauma therapist, not the gender therapist. Happened to be the same. And he wrote me back for 3 more weeks after that. I said, Walt, I'm free. I'm free. Every week, I'm free. Now, I asked a Christian therapist of mine, can EMDR therapy really be that effective that quick? He said, it doesn't happen that often, but yes. So what's the point here? The point is, if we can identify and show the individuals and have them talk to us about the point, the issue, the trauma, and that we can take our best efforts and put them in contact with the best trauma therapist, they get healed. And we need Jesus. We need to have faith in our Lord Jesus Christ. And I was lucky because, I was an associate design engineer on the Apollo space missions. I was a national operations manager for American Honda Motor Company and one of the people who developed the Acura division. But I was also carrying a baggage of abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, all my life. And I crashed behind cocaine, alcohol, and drugs because I didn't have the therapy I needed. I went to a gender therapist in San Francisco who was the author of the standards of care that are in existence today called WPATH. That was my therapist. He approved me for surgery. I had the full surgery, and here I am today. Why? Because through my alcohol and drug addiction, I went into a women's recovery center because I was identifying as Laura, and started working on my AA issues. And I was going to a therapist, working out my 4-step. And for people who don't know the 4-step, that's where you kind of regurgitate everything, pray over it, have somebody work with you. And that was almost a 3-hour session with the Christian therapist. And we went through line by line. I had 21 line papers, a paper with 21 different pages with all these things on it. And we went through them and prayed about each one of them. Sexual abuse, emotional abuse, physical abuse, all the mistakes that I'd made. And at the end of that 3-hour session, he said, let's go outside. And we went outside, took the papers, and he stood in the parking lot where his office was, and he took a match and he lit those papers that afternoon in Pleasanton, California. And the flames engulfed those yellow papers, and they disappeared up into the air. And he patted me on the shoulder and he says, okay. He said, let's now go up and pray. Now, don't judge me, okay, guys? I mean, this guy is a guy that'll pray for 2 or 3 hours, and I knew that, and I thought I was going to miss my dinner. I was going to miss all my favorite TV shows, and I was going to get to bed late if I stayed and had him pray. But he'd given me this time, so I thought, I'm going to do it. And so back in his office, we're facing each other, and he begins to pray. And he's praying. And I'm guilty of thinking, how long is he going to pray? And he's praying. And he's praying. And there was a point where I couldn't hear him anymore. I just didn't hear him. But what I saw was the Lord Jesus coming down toward me. And I looked in front of me, and there was a little baby in front of me. And the Lord was coming for that baby, and that baby was me. The Lord was coming to redeem my life from the mother who didn't want me. And all of the brokenness that ever happened to me, he was coming to redeem me that day and restore my life full and vibrant and healthy, so that I can come and tell you today about the power and grace of Jesus Christ in the redemption of a life that is broken by transgenderism. Thank you very much.